I will explain the knitting method called Kihnu Vits or Latvian braid. In a nutshell, this is a technique that uses the float between purl stitches. If you mix only one row of purl stitches with the stockinette fabric, it will look raised. This is because when you make a purl stitch, the apex of the previous stitch and the sinker loop between the stitches appear on the surface. If you leave a stitch gap between stitches, the sinker loop will become a long float and will stand out. When you want to make such a long float, if you use only one thread, you have to slip with yarn in front to skip the stitches. However, if you use two threads, you can make a long float by knitting alternately without skipping stitches. This is the basic principle of Latvian braid. It is possible to knit using two threads of the same color, but in general, two colors are often used. From here, let's see the detailed operations while actually knitting. In fact, Latvian braid has two patterns depending on whether you make a thin line or a thick line. First, let's see how to knit a thin line. First, as a preliminary preparation, make knit stitches alternately with two threads. In the next row, purl with a thread of a different color from the stitch color of the previous row. Also, at this time, bring the yarn so that it passes under the unused yarn. Every time we knit one stitch, we bring the next thread so that it passes under the thread and knit it. If you always bring the thread from the bottom like this, the thread will gradually twist. And the floats will also be lined up in a twisted shape. This twisted floats are the point of Latvian braid. Above the floats you can see the vertices of the stitches in the previous row. At first glance, it looks like the chain extends sideways. However, this only looks like that because the floats and stitches are aligned, and they are structurally separate. In order to match the color of the float and the stitch in this way, it is necessary to knit with a color different from the color of the previous row. Once you knit one row, you're done. In this case, you have to put the twisted thread back on your own. Next, I will explain how to knit a thick line. As a preliminary preparation, weaving knit stitches alternately in two colors is the same as for thin lines. In the next row, purl with the same color thread for the stitch color of the previous row. The difference is that you use the same color. The way to twist the thread is the same as before, and bring the thread from the underside of the unused thread. When we knit one row in this way, it became like this. The float and stitch positions are out of alignment compared to the thin lines. Let's leave the twist of the thread as it is and go to the next row. Again, purl with the same color thread for the stitch color in the previous row. However, unlike before, bring the thread so that it passes over the unused thread. In other words, it is a movement that untwists. After knitting one stitch, bring the next thread so that it passes over it, and so on. By doing this, the twist of the threads will be the opposite of that of the previous row, and the twist will gradually disappear. After knitting one row, the twist disappeared completely and it returned to the original state. The floats pattern is vertically symmetrical, and it looks like there is a thick chain. In the case of thin line, the float and stitch colors are matched to create a pattern like a thin chain, and in the case of thick line, the floats are twisted in reverse to create a thick chain pattern. This is the explanation of Kihnu Vits or Latvian braid. Floats are usually hidden behind the fabric, but it's an interesting technique to expose them to the surface and use them as decorations. Thank you for your viewing.